But what I'd like us to do tonight is we're actually going to be having a conversation about justice through the lens of something called shalom. Everybody say shalom. It just feels good to say, doesn't it? Shalom. Many of you probably know what this word is, but just in case some of you don't, shalom is a Hebrew word. And, I'm a father, and I walk through the biblical story with my kids on a regular basis, and we talk about this word shalom. And so I find myself needing to find ways to explain it so that a 6-year-old can understand pieces of what it is. And a lot of the ways that shalom is translated in your Bibles, it's usually translated as peace, if you see it in the English translation. And while this is a really good word to put in there, there's a lot of strange trajectories that this can send your mind that are unhelpful. So this is what I mean by this. Shalom is not just an absence of war. It's not just an absence of conflict. It's really not even just a negation of something that's taking place, like violence is taking place and there's not violence, so there's peace. Shalom is actually substantive. It is something, and so what is it? This is the way I describe it to my kids. I'll talk about shalom as peace, but I'll say shalom is when everything is the way it's supposed to be. Shalom is like a puzzle that's put together completely. Like, you know that feeling when you do a jigsaw puzzle that's like 1,000 pieces and you've been working on it for hours and hours and hours, and you found that last one piece that your family member accidentally flipped onto the floor, and you stick it in there, and because you wouldn't be that family member, right? Somebody else did it. You stick it in there and you see this completed picture. And this is actually the way, the Israelites would have thought about this word this way, like a brick wall that's complete. No brick is lacking. This is this idea of completion, of wholeness, of fullness, right? And there's a theologian, Cornelius Plantinga Jr., that talks about shalom, and the phrase I used earlier, everything the way it's supposed to be. That's like his phrase for shalom. And I want us in these 10 or 15 minutes to have a conversation about shalom, because the more you understand shalom, the more you understand the substance of what this is in relation to the biblical story, the more you're going to be able to take in the topic of justice. The more you're going to be able to hear the categories of justice and relate it appropriately to your world, okay? So what I'd like us to do is, I have behind me, as I mentioned, the 4 hinge points of the story. We're going to walk through these together, and I want us to do so. Sometimes we walk through these hinge points, and we literally we kind of talk through the story. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We talk about creation. We go on to Genesis 3 with the rebellion. We skip forward to the moment when Christ dies on the cross, bringing an end to death and sin, is raised to new life, the beginning, the start of the new creation. And then we talk about this glorious future, that as Christ followers, we look at this story and we say, this is the true story of the whole world. The church is not just a private institution made to exist for its members. The church is a public institution or a public assembly. That's what the original word ecclesia means. It means public assembly. And the truth that we declare is not just a private truth. Rick talked about it this morning, how we live in a pluralistic society which can say, like, if your truth is good for you, then that's great. I'm happy for you, but this is my truth. The early church from the very beginning very much rejected that notion and said, no, this story is the true story. And we are the ecclesia. We are this true new humanity that's been reborn through the work of Christ, that's been made new through the work of Jesus. And this truth is not just truth for a private sector of society, but it's truth for the whole world. And so that's kind of what I want to frame our conversation in, is this idea of who we are as the church, and this concept or this reality of shalom. So let's start in the beginning. I want us to start back in creation. Before we do that, I want you, maybe this will help give you your warm and fuzzies that you'll need to fully embrace shalom. I want everybody to close their eyes, and we're not going to do yoga or anything like that, but close your eyes, and just imagine with me right now like a place of peace, like a physical place that you've been before or a place that you'd like to be. What are you doing? What are you engaging in? Do you have other people there? Are you alone? What's this place like? Just go there for a moment in your mind. Think about the feelings that you have in this place. Think about the warmth of this place to your soul, to your mind, to your heart. Think about the comforting aspects of this place. All right, you can open your eyes now. The weird exercise is over. Wherever you went to, there's probably elements of that are going to be good and beneficial for you when we talk about and think about shalom. There might be elements of that won't be helpful, like if your favorite place to go is like a football stadium or something like that. I don't know. It might be, it might not be. But you think about that place. You think about that place where your soul feels at rest. So, as we stated before, God, in the beginning, the eternal God, who is not created the heavens and the earth. And we say those two words, but if you think about it this way, heaven and earth, heaven is God's throne room, the place, not the place of his dwelling, but kind of like his command center, if you will. It's a place of his glorious presence. Heaven and earth were essentially one thing. They weren't two things. And as God's loving rule sat over his good creation, and as God said about his creation, do you remember the two words that he used, my creation? He looked at it and he said, it is not just good, but very good, yes. As God's loving presence sat and saturated the very good creation, there was shalom. Everything was operating the way it was designed, was supposed to operate. There was peace, there was harmony, there was beauty, truth, goodness, all in this place. Heaven and earth essentially were woven together. Shalom was woven together. So if you think about just this first moment when there was peace and harmony, it was woven together. But, we all know how this story progresses. We get 3 chapters into the Bible, and an enemy slithers into the garden, right? The serpent, who was more crafty than all the other animals, creatures that God had made, slips in and starts to weave in slowly and seductively this idea or this path that says you can actually find greater shalom, greater peace, more godlike existence if you disobey what God had said, if you go against what he has commanded you to do. And so we've said it before this way. We say we. Some of you are sitting there going, we? I'm not Adam. I wasn't Eve. I wasn't there, right? But we say we because the Bible actually says that Adam and Eve were like our CEO in that moment, if you want to view it that way. They were the ones that made the decisions. And in that moment, they chose and we all chose with them to rebel against God. And when we rebelled, when we chose to go our own way, forge our own path forward, what essentially happened is heaven and earth were torn in two. Heaven was torn from earth, if you will. And if you read through the Bible, you'll notice this. The Bible doesn't say heaven and hell. It says heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will never pass away. Those are the two things that are always in conjunction with each other, heaven and earth. And so heaven and earth are essentially separated from one another. And when this happens, the shalom is fractured, it's shattered. The fabric of shalom is ripped apart, torn asunder, if you will. And what we see happen is to the earth come sin and death and corruption because of our rebellion, because of our decision to forge our own path, to trust in a lie. This corruption came. And this is the world that we live in. We did that exercise because we can't just go, hey, think about your world and see everything the way it's supposed to be. Because we look at our world and what do we see? Everything is not the way it's supposed to be. We see glimpses of goodness and hope, but we are filled with a world that is filled with violence, is filled with all sorts of things that hurt our heart, that cause us to cry, that cause us to live in pain and difficulty. And this is what we see from Genesis 3, that God pronounces, he declares this curse because of our decision. Which one of them is thorns and thistles will come up from the ground. And those of you who know me know that this is the moment when bougainvillea plants emerged from the earth, okay? They were not there before we chose to rebel. How many of you guys have bougainvilleas in your house? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Those thorny things. So this curse is pronounced. And from this moment, from Genesis 3, we see so much development between this hinge point in the story and this hinge point. But what I want you to think about, we're not going to cover all of that. I'm going to go behind here for a second. In this moment, this is the moment when shalom invaded our rebellion. Think about it this way. This is the moment when the new creation, the new restoration, broke into history. And how did it do so? It broke through in the person of Jesus. Jesus is the embodiment, is actually the new kingdom. He is the shalom of here being brought into and broken into history. It is embodied in his very person, in his life, and it is inaugurated in his death. And it is shown to us, the shalom, this future restoration is shown to us in his resurrection. This good news, this new creation that broke into history, it reminds us of the shalom of the garden. It causes us to look back and to recognize that the world didn't start here. Sometimes when you ask somebody to share the gospel with you, you say, what is the gospel? I've heard people say it this way. You are hopelessly in sin, and you desperately need a Savior. And Jesus died on the cross to save you from your sins. Is that true? Yes, it's true. You can all say, yes, it's true. But is it the whole story? No. I was with a group just recently, and I was talking about this phrase that I've heard. You can't know the good news unless you know the bad news. How many of you have heard that before? You can't appreciate the good news until you've heard the bad news. Okay, not many, but with some tribes, it's like a popular phrase, right? And with this tribe that I was speaking to, it was. And I said, but here's the deal. You can't really understand why the bad news is bad unless you know the intentions of the good creator and unless you can see in some ways this good creation. So we see the trajectory of this story when the shalom, the peace, the wholeness, the fullness of God breaks into history through the person and the work of Jesus. He points our attention forward to a day when there will be no more pain, no more suffering, no more sickness, no more death. Every tear will be wiped away. This moment when heaven and earth that were together in the creation, that were torn apart by our rebellion, will be brought together as one. These pictures that we see in the Bible, like in the end of Revelation, where we see this new city coming down and being established on the earth. Or pictures like we see in Ezekiel, I think it's Ezekiel 47, where you see the throne room of God established on the earth, and you see this river start to flow from the throne. It goes out into the creation. And every place that the river goes that's flowing from God's throne, it fills with life and it flourishes and it finds its wholeness and its fullness and its fulfillment. And so when we think about the story through the lens of shalom, we need to realize that we are a people that carry good news that's not just simply believe in Jesus and you'll go to heaven. It's not just simply individualistic. It is the good news that God has called a people unto himself to be a blessing in the areas to which he has sent them. So when you think about Via Church, think about a people that God has called. And then extend that even further and realize that God has formed a people as his church in the world, that he has called unto himself a people that would testify to this good news, to this true story, that God is making all things new in Christ. Paul says it this way: when you see someone who is in Christ, behold, the new creation has begun. This shalom that is coming, this peace and this wholeness, is actually at work in the present. God is doing his work through us as his people, and through this world, he's giving us glimpses to see the peace and the wholeness and the fullness that is to come. I know, again, Rick this morning in his message, he talked about the life of Jesus. And this is so important for us to think about the parables that Jesus shared. He talked about the kingdom of God, right? So many times, the kingdom of God is like. The kingdom of God is like. And he would share parables to give pictures of what God's kingdom is like. This is very different than the kingdoms of the world. He healed people, pointing to the reality that this kingdom that is coming, this shalom that is coming, a foretaste of that is this healing that Jesus provides, saying in this future there will be restored physical existence. Your bodies will function really well. Many in the room, we would say hallelujah for that, right? They function. He raises Lazarus from the dead, saying that death will be defeated. Death will be no more, right? Which is what Christ accomplished. He even does signs and wonders for the creation. You remember the moment when the sea is raging, and what does Jesus do? But he calms the sea. This shalom is going to bring calm to the creation itself. Think about Romans 8 for a moment. This moment where Paul goes, look, the creation is longing for its freedom. The good creation that God made, that like even the trees, I've told you guys this before. Next time you see a tree, you might get a little freaked out, but the tree, in some ways, sees what is happening and it's longing for its liberation, Paul would say in Romans 8. Because the good tree that God made was cast into futility by our rebellion. It was put into bondage by our rebellion. But because of the work of Christ and because the new creation has started to spring up in us as God's people, has started to spring up in this world, the good creation, even the trees, know that one day their restoration is coming. That one day everything will be made new. And so when we think about the topic of justice, I really want to key in on this. It's really important that we don't lob off the ends of this story when we talk about justice. It is very significant that we're talking about what does it mean to be God's people in 2018 in the city of Mesa. God cares about our city. He cares about the people in our city. And he's placed us here for a purpose and for a reason. I'll end with this thought. Right now, we're going through the book of Ezekiel together as a church. This moment is a moment when God's people have been taken into exile. Because of their disobedience, because of their rebellion, God has pronounced judgment on them, and these other empires have come in, they've taken them. Babylon obviously took many of the intelligent, the young, the youth, those that were more prominent into their capital city to begin to shape them more and more. And the prophet Jeremiah writes a letter to the exiles that are in Babylon. And it's interesting what he tells them, because there was a wealth of prophets during that time that were saying, don't worry, this is going to be all over just like this. Don't worry. It's going to be days, weeks, and this whole thing's going to blow over. And Jeremiah writes this letter, and he says, first of all, disregard what those prophets are saying. They're false prophets. And then he says, this is what you need to do. I want you to seek the welfare of the city to which I have sent you. God is speaking through the prophet. I want you to seek the welfare of the city to which I have sent you. And the word welfare that Jeremiah uses is the word shalom. I want you to seek the peace of the city to which I have sent you. So Via, this is a very important conversation for us. This is an important conversation for us to sink our teeth into, because when we think about what it is to be the church, we need to realize that blessing our city, blessing the place where God has sent us, is what he has called us to do. It's who he's called us to be. So, my talk is done. Was that about 15 minutes? Okay, roughly, probably 20. This is what I'd like you to do. Grab the sheet that you got on your way in, and in a moment, I'm going to invite Michael Dvorak up, and we're going to be here and have a conversation about law enforcement, to see our city really through the eyes of our law enforcement individuals. But before we go into that, I want you to have a discussion around your tables regarding the biblical story and justice. And I want you to think about this quote, first of all. I'll read this quote. It's on the back of your handout. This is from Tim Keller's book, Generous Justice. He says this: "To do justice means to go to places where the fabric of shalom has broken down, where the weaker members of societies are falling through the fabric, and to repair it. The only way to reweave and strengthen the fabric is by weaving yourself into it. If we keep our money, time, and power to ourselves, for ourselves, instead of sending them out into our neighbors' lives, then we may be literally on top of one another, but we are not interwoven socially, relationally, financially, and emotionally. Reweaving shalom means to sacrificially thread, lace, and press your time, goods, power, and resources into the lives and needs of others." Powerful quote for us to consider and to think about in light of this topic. And what I'd like you to do is have a table discussion. Take a few moments around your tables to imagine how the gifts that God has given you could be utilized to bless, love, and serve your neighbor. This could be stories of how God has worked this in your life, or this could be you imagining the ways that God might want to do this in you in the future, okay? So have a conversation related to that. That's kind of that second discussion point around your tables, and then we're going to have a conversation with Michael Dvorak, all right? Go for it. Excellent. All right. Well, let's transition now into a conversation with Michael Dvorak, who is one of the assistant chiefs on the police department here in Mesa. And so, first of all, Michael, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for taking some time out of your Sunday to be with us. And really what I hope is to help us to really see our city from a different angle than we all see it. And so thank you so much for being with us and giving us your time. First thing, just tell us a little bit about your role and maybe a little bit about yourself, just so we can kind of understand who you are as well.
Good evening. First of all, thanks for having me here. I appreciate it. As you can see, I'm a hand talker, so sitting in a chair is going to make me want to move even more. So bear with my talking. It's my Chicagoism that comes out a little bit. But I actually grew up in Chicago. I've been in Arizona since I was a senior in high school, so long-standing time here in Arizona, but I still have connections certainly back to the Midwest and Chicago. My role is one of the assistant chiefs here at the police department, and with that, for the most part, is an oversight of all that we do in our organization. I've been with the agency about 30 years, so I've worked pretty much every part of it. So in terms of the oversight of what we do, our chiefs are really our main role, I would say, is our connection out into the community. We are out every single day talking or in some group doing presentations. And as we say in the presentation world, the worst thing you can do is follow a pastor. So,
there you go.
I already lost that one tonight, I guess, because, but really a lot of what our organization is about is, in terms of what the chiefs are about, is getting that connectivity to the community. I think one of the things in Mesa we have done well traditionally has been that. And certainly our main thrust is we are part of the community. And I'll kind of start off with my introduction in that regard is we just don't come here to work. I live here. My kids go to school here. We go to church in this community. We go to everything in this community. So when you are embedded in the community, it is your community. And then policing, to me, that is super important. It is about, this is where you live, so everything you do is the very fabric of your community as well. And you're the ones out coaching, you're the ones out volunteering, you're the ones out hopefully making a difference even when you're not working. And to me, that's something we certainly encourage in our agency, and we see that is the case. Where I'm from in Chicago, it's not quite that way. You don't always see the same dynamic. So certainly here, it's what we subscribe to. In my time with Mesa, having been fortunate really through all our growth over the years, you've seen tremendous changes, and certainly I lend a little bit of experience. I mentioned to someone I started really young doing this, but the reality is that we're a huge city. This is the 36th largest city in the country. Think about that. And when you think about the whole collective valley, how interchangeable it is in terms of this is larger than Chicago when you think about the valley as a whole. East Valley is large as well. And I think one of the strengths in the East Valley that you'll see is not only are we connected in the community, we are connected with each other throughout law enforcement and throughout the cities. We have a lot of oversight in terms of just where we don't think of crime or issues just in this city alone. We actually think of it regionally, which is really super important in terms of the effectiveness that policing should have, certainly not only in their own city, but in the communities that surround them as well. So in my sense, very, very fortunate to be, I think, with the best department in the country. And my time here, like I said, my family is here. I have 4 older kids that are kind of out and about in their 20s. I have 5 kids between age 8 and 13. They're on spring break this week, so they're ready to go back to school tomorrow. We're ready for them to go back to school tomorrow, but it just speaks to what I was referring to is I live right down the road here. So we are in this community, and from my end have that kind of personal connectivity to what we're going to talk about today.
Excellent, thank you. So for those of us who aren't as familiar, can you describe like the police department in our city? Just like maybe even structurally, what does it look like? We see officers around, but we may not understand the chain of command, how it's all organized. Like, just describe the police department and maybe even some of the uniquenesses about the police department here in Mesa.
Yeah, we refer to I think, policing as paramilitary only in its structure. For those that have been in the military, it's not too dissimilar in terms of the officers that you see on the street are really where you start. After you go to the police academy, you come out to your training program, and then you're a solo beat officer. So the officers you see in the marked cars are really the starting point for everyone. You don't come in and be a SWAT guy right from the beginning. You learn your fundamentals and your basics from being on the street. So there's an officer, there's supervisors that you'll see on the street as well, our sergeants and our patrol bureaus. So you see sergeants, lieutenants, and then there's a commander that's over each district. Mesa being a rather large place, we have 4 districts, hopefully 5 here in the near future, but right now we're split into 4 quadrants. You're actually situated in our Superstition Patrol District. Its station is down at Ellsworth and Baseline. But they patrol this all the way to the north border, certainly to the east border up until right around Higley. And then we have a Red Mountain District, which is all the patrol officers that service the area from about Higley. And if you travel west, it kind of goes back and forth on some borders, but right around Stapley or so. And then in our most populated area on the west side, we have two districts. One is basically works north of Broadway, our central district, and then our Fiesta district works south of Broadway to the city limits. So very large, almost 100 officers or so in each one of those districts. Population now, we're approaching like 487,000 people here in the city of Mesa. They expect us to be at 515 by 2022. So it's a big place, and you think about all the people that come in for school at the hospitals during the day and how that population grows and contracts throughout the day and what challenges those bring as well. So we have 4 patrol districts where about 330 officers work specifically in patrol beats. But we also have a large contingent of officers that support what the patrol officers do. And we call those our specialty units. And they range from motor officers that are on the street every day with them, canine officers who everyone loves, they love the dogs, right? Air unit overhead, and then there's detectives that work behind on all the crimes. And then we have a lot of undercover on the street as well, and SWAT officers as well that are supporting the street directly day in and day out. And those specialty units is really part of really why our crime fighting model here in Mesa, to me, is top level. And I travel throughout the country. We have one of the lowest crime rates for a major city in the entire country. Right. And I will say that we don't take credit for that. How I use the credit in that regard is it's so many factors that go into that. Number one is the commitment by the community, from in terms of resources. Number two is we hire the best men and women we can find. And secondly and lastly, the third part of that is our community connectivity. And I'll tell you an example real quick, and then I'll stop here so I don't go too long. The third part is the community part. Now, why we solve so many crimes is because people talk to us, and that comes from trust. That comes from interaction. If they don't talk to us, we don't know about the crime maybe in the front end, or if we do know, we don't have any information that helps us solve them. So our strength, in my belief, certainly and throughout the East Valley, but with Mesa as really a primary example, is the importance of our involvement and embedding with the community. That is what you see here that struggles in certain models throughout the country. Is it perfect all the time? No. Your relationships are not perfect anywhere, and neither are they in these settings, but it's something we work on continuously. It's that important. So when we see the crime drop, there's a lot of factors to it, but I really address those three areas as to why, with probably the most primary area is our ability to connect with the community, because if they tell us what's going on, it gives us that huge advantage. And if they feel comfortable and they trust us, we're in good shape. And that's certainly something that takes effort every single day. So I guess in a quick synopsis, there's your patrol, there's your backdrop of those who support patrol. And really it's a very fine-tuned crime-fighting type approach that we've worked on over the years and has a lot of very talented people making it work.
Thank you. So when we think about Mesa, let's kind of turn our attention towards our city for a moment and share with us just some of the struggles of our city. When we talk about this story and we think about the brokenness of our world, what are some of the ways that you, and even when I say you, the police department, sees this brokenness firsthand? What are some things that you just go, we really need to address this, we need to think about this that's ailing our city? What are some of those things?
Well, several come to mind, and I think some are really we see it nationally, and I'll say certainly drug use and the opioid condition we're in. We're certainly impacted here in Mesa to different levels than other cities, but we see that as well. So drug use is certainly one of our major problems, but I'll point to one that is maybe not always on the front of the radar for everybody, and that is mental illness and those who suffer from mental illness. To me, the resources that are needed to help those people that are suffering from mental illness are to me, of primary importance. And here's why. Policing is really most of our job. I use the word peace officer in a lot of cases, not just police officer. Our job is to keep the peace, but really we're the front lines for social services. We usually arrive on somebody's worst day or when they don't know where else to turn to. And most of the things we do are not arrests and they're not tickets like people believe. Because in our day in life, we don't deal with police very much unless we get into an accident or we get stopped or we're a victim of a burglary or something. But for the most part, most of our time is spent interacting with those that are struggling the most in that regard. The resources that we can refer them to are the most important element of problem solving that we have. We don't want to, let's say the problem is a mental health issue. We don't want it to be a crime issue, right? You're not going to police your way from that because really the core element of the problem is the mental illness itself or what they're suffering from, and getting them to the right help, the right assistance, and helping the families out that are really struggling with that concept is a huge part before it becomes a crisis, and then we're in a situation that's where we don't want to be. So I point to that on the front end because I would say a majority of our major incidents have an element of mental illness involved in that. Drug use certainly would be the other parts of that go along. Some are kind of overlap and some are exclusive. But both problems are for the most part, apparent in most major violent cases that we're involved with or problems. So what I really speak to the most is our challenge isn't just enforcing what's going on. It's really finding solutions to the social problems behind what's going on so that we can refer them to the community services, which is really going to handle the root cause. The root cause isn't always the crime. That's a result of what situation they're in. And certainly we'll deal with that when it happens. But the idea, I think, is the continued partnerships and the work of our community to find those resources so we have good referrals. So I kind of put that at top of the list because I actually think that's one of the, right there with drug use as our most common prevailing issue. The third I'll talk about is things that I see more behind the scenes, which are me most troubling. One of the issues that I talk about the most is I call it sex trafficking, a term that you see quite a bit throughout the country. It's here as well. We have human trafficking in the state of Arizona. You have it in every state in the country. Our most vulnerable people in our society are certainly subject to that area. In Mesa, we started a unit specific to that 3 years ago. And we've been working it for all the years before that, but now we had a specific full-time detectives, and we have collaborated with the community resources, and from a regional task force standpoint, it is an ongoing, every single day effort on our part. With priorities of emphasis is we're trying to rescue juveniles that are brought into that arena. That any rescue we have is a huge success story if we can intervene. But that's one that isn't always one you're going to see walking down the streets. It's behind on internet today. It's not on Main Street. It's behind the curtain, if you will. And secondarily, it touches all walks of life. Every profession is touched by that in some regards. So somebody has that anonymous ability to do that behind the scenes in the internet and some of the others. So we have units that just work on that entirely, and that is a statewide initiative focused for us in Mesa as a unit itself, and then we connect regionally as well. So I throw that as one that maybe isn't always on the one that people notice or they think of in that regard as really social ills that we need to confront, and in that case, certainly criminal activity.
And I think those probably, for many of us in this room, should become prayer points for us when we think about our city, especially prayer points for us when we consider folks within our community who are stepping into like the front lines of some of that. Tell me, how do you, as an officer, and how do officers in general, I mean, I consider the reality that you guys face on a daily basis, the kinds of situations that you step into, the weight of the pain that you're exposed to. How do you guys care for your own soul? Like, show us the human part of what it is to be a police officer. How do you guys care for yourselves? What does that look like?
Perfect, I think, segue into really what we're confronted with today more than ever before. PTSD is very common in I would say not just law enforcement, but also for our medical professionals in the fire department. We go on scenes that are unfortunately very tragic and gruesome at times. So we have our men and women on the front line certainly struggle with certainly seeing the carnage that exists at times in form, whether it's a traffic accident or whether it's a crime. But if I may, I'll start first here is in the academy, we stand up on day one and we ask every recruit, and I've had the academy for a lot of my career, why do you want to be a police officer? And there's two answers you'll get, one or the other, sometimes both. Number one is, I want to make a difference in my community. Number two is I want to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, our most vulnerable in our community. Now, I start there because if you start with those two ideals that are 100% part of why you do this job, you're in good shape. Your next challenge, certainly us from an executive staff of overseeing a police department, is how do we help the men and women that do this job keep those ideals and support them while they try to handle those ideals? Because we're out there with people in distress, those who are being taken advantage of, those who have been through trauma, those who are in very different predicaments, those rendering help we have to look out at from our agency, because as we talk about, we have to take care of them so they can take care of everyone else. And if they're not in a good mental condition to do that, they certainly can't render that kind of help to them. So our focus has been, we actually have a bureau that we set up about 4 years ago now called the Community Engagement Employee Wellness Bureau. So we have an assistant chief specifically in charge of looking after the wellness programs of our men and women that do this job. That comes in the form of, we have really decades of peer support. So when they're out on a major scene and something traumatic happens, we have counselors and people available to them to talk to, fellow officers that have experience with that. They're not immune to the everyday lives that everyone else has in terms of marital problems or parents with sickness, children that are ill. So our peer support's really, for a large measure, connects them to so many social resources to help them in a good way. So their support mechanism, we certainly strive to be robust, strong, and realistic to today's conditions. So not only in the form of counseling, but really just in the form of having support and understanding the trauma that they go through from what you see. I can tell you names of people I remember from 28 years ago that I was on their accident where someone died. I was on a fatal accident involving a 19-year-old whose name I still remember as if it's my own family. My sister was 19 at that time, so that could have been my sister. So they live that every day in some respects, and we have to help talk about really how to put that in its compartment in the best place, but at the same time, keep their compassion and their empathy for what they do. And that's a balance to have. You have to, because really the skill in our job, in my opinion, is how well you can read what's going on and display compassion and empathy for those who are struggling at the moment. It's not just about taking someone to jail. It's also about helping those that are victimized, helping those that may be on their first accident as a 16-year-old and sitting on the curb with that person and go, it'll be okay, even though they don't think so until they get home, right? So I think it's that wide range of resources to help the officers, for the men and women that do this, that keeps them strong so we're in the field, they can carry out the good work.
Thank you for sharing that, Michael. Appreciate that. This question maybe goes a little bit of a different direction, but in what areas do you see the church like capital C, failing to either see the need or make an impact in Mesa, specifically areas that would benefit both the community and law enforcement? So maybe is there a gap somewhere that you perceive as an officer between a community of people that love and care deeply about their community that they live in and a group of people who love and care deeply about the community in which they live? Are there any voids there that you just say, man, it would be good if the church could step in or if this void could be filled somehow?
Sure. And if I go too long on these answers, tap me, okay? Because I don't know if I can go 20 minutes like you can, but I can go.
It's a special set of skills.
Obviously, yeah, right. But we were talking earlier, and I go back to the community element, and I'll tell you kind of how well it works, and I think where the opportunities lie in this area. In Mesa, I talked about our crime earlier on, and I speak to this because we actually have 11 forums in our communities with part of our outreach. So every part of our community has some forum that meets directly with the chief, with the executive staff, the officers, whether it's monthly or every 2 months. And it's all parts of our community. We have a clergy forum. We have disabilities forum. We have Hispanic forum. Every part of our community has at least that outreach mechanism in addition to their one-on-one contacts from their areas in that regard. The reason I say that on the front end, because to me that is our window into talking about things before things are in crisis. So we're talking about what are they seeing, what are we seeing collectively. We see most of similar things, I would say. But the communication of that's really important. When we meet, it's interesting. One of the comments I made when I was sitting in the back there was, when we went to the clergy forum, we were actually talking about the value of different congregations and different churches holding joint events together where the police come and multiply their forces on some of the activities they're trying to do. And how much interest there was from a lot of different entities in that discussion. So I think from the police department's end, we're part of the community. We don't drive every piece of that. And so I think we can help connect that together. When I talked earlier on the social resources, which I think speaks to the question, is our gap is finding the social resources and making sure we have enough of them. Beds for those that are getting away from a domestic abuser. Places to take the children that DCS works on, that they have foster homes and places to have overnight. People that can come out and help those that are mentally ill, that can convince them and find some halfway house, or them to at least convince them to go into care. Those sorts of things. So we do not have enough of in all those arenas to help. The good part of this community is when a well-advertised event happens, we get overwhelming support. So the heart is there. I think the challenge is connecting all the hearts that are out there trying to do the good work into making sure that we're covering those gaps and that we're providing those levels of services to those who are really in most need of them. And I think that's really where our connectivity with the community has its largest challenge, but also its biggest opportunity at the same time. And I think that's ultimately what's going to make our community stronger, is the more we have of that, the more places we can get people the correct help they need. And I think that's the gaps that we struggle with, is when you have somebody looking for help and we have no place to get them to. And we're pretty resourceful people to figure out something, but the more we have of that resource, the better off we are.
Well, that's really encouraging to hear. One of the things that I wanted to mention to us is we're in a conversation right now with the Mesa Police Department, with Ray Villa actually specifically, about an event this summer that would be kind of, I guess, hosted by Villa, by us, but the police department would come and actually present this event to the community at large. And so we're looking at maybe some dates in June or July, so be looking for that. But it would be a moment for the churches in our area to come together, but then even just the wider community to come together and hear a little bit more about what the police department's facing and just some things that we need to be aware of as a community. So I'm looking forward to that, and it sounds like that's a piece of this whole thing. So you mentioned foster care. This is an arena that we as a church have just felt very compelled to step forward into, and alongside many other churches in the Phoenix area that look and see, I think it's around 17,000 kids in the foster care system currently. In the past, that number's been a lot higher. But when you consider foster care, the orphan crisis that we're in, speak to us on that from your perspective as an officer, and even personally, talk to us a little bit about that dynamic, because that's one for us that we've addressed in multiple different ways. We have folks that serve in group homes on a regular basis. We have communities that have actually, some of our VIA communities, some of you may not know this, but that have purchased supplies for like moms, where DCS has come in and they've said, hey, look, if you can just get a bed and a crib and that fan fixed, we won't have to take your kids out and put them into care. And so we've had VIA communities that have stepped up, provided those things, and we also have folks that foster and have adopted within our own community. So that's something that's really close to our heart. Speak for a moment just on that topic, if you would, personally, but also as an officer from that perspective.
Now, I'll start, because of this audience, I think you can relate to what I'm saying, but I'll start with this piece of it. I used to watch the movie Boys Town when I was young. Now, it was reruns, don't get me wrong, but there's a movie, if you remember, talk about Boys Town, which was a Catholic orphanage for kids that didn't have parents and such. And interesting quote that I always carry with me, and then I'll leap into the story real quick in less than 10 minutes, is talked about there's never bad kids, there's only bad parents. And I talk about that a lot in what we do, because we deal a lot with those that are struggling in our community that are juveniles. And if you're struggling then, imagine how difficult you're going to have it when you're an adult. So our interaction, I think, with those at-risk juveniles is one of our largest challenges in policing, because we're not looking for arrests. We're looking for how to connect them and how to make sure they have mentors, whether it's in our PAL program or whether it's in Boys and Girls Club that we have partnerships with. Is how do we get them on the right track? Because the truth is, for officers coming in, not everybody can relate to the fact that they didn't have two parents. That some of them didn't have any. And when you don't have that guidance, how important that gap is and that void is, and how impactful it will be to their growth. So with that, we encounter that a lot. Certainly we are out in the community where a lot of juveniles are struggling, whether it's through our group homes, our families, broken families, where kids are in deplorable conditions, and they probably don't have much chance if they don't get some assistance in terms of compared to what they currently have. You talked about our DCS system, our state system. It's about 17,000. About half of those are, I do know these stats because I'm involved in this arena quite a bit. About half of those are waiting to be adopted, and the other half are in foster care, give or take a little bit every year. So the need for foster families is large. We certainly see that because DCS works with us hand in hand. We have a family advocacy center here in Mesa, which we actually have in-house not only detectives, but we have medical professionals, DCS, and other social agencies that work out of that center. So as you can imagine, when you're dealing with a catastrophic situation involving a family where someone's been abused or some terrible things are occurring, having those resources available while we're doing it is important so that we can get them into a foster family or somewhere to stay that night with the least amount of trauma as possible other than what they've already experienced. So in that regard, it's a big part of what we're involved with. From the personal end that he's referring to, I have 4 older kids. I have 5 kids that are 8 to 13. They are all adopted from the state system, from my wife and I. I'm married spectacular, so my wife is awesome. But we have 2 sibling groups who are both from large families. Our 4 older kids were on their way, so we have 2 sisters and a brother that came about 4 years ago, and then a brother and sister that arrived to our house about a year and a half ago now. All part of the family. But what's been interesting part of that was we actually go before the parents board at the panels at a lot of the adoption and foster care places that are putting on programs for new foster families and new adoption families. We get a chance to talk to the parents what to expect. And the amazing part of it is how rewarding that is, how daunting it is to think about. And after going through it, people at work, I can't tell you how many people came up and said, I was adopted. I was in foster care. And they're doing amazing things today. And then even the neighbors, they'll donate everything you can think of. We have more bikes coming our way than we ever knew, right? But really what I said is, but there's so many things that support our children that are not, even if you can't be a foster family or an adoption, is those that are mentoring those that I call are most vulnerable. I'll tie it back into my other story, is when you're 18 years old and you leave the foster care system in many cases, where do you go? Think about that. Do we want the street helping them, or do we, So it's finding those bridge places to be, helping them get set up, the mentorship of those established in whether it's in industry or in work, to help them through balancing checkbooks and just doing normal things that we almost do seamlessly. So all those there's so many things to support, and then lastly, it's always to support those that are able to do the families. So when you talk about, to me, it's the work that's really important. It's the part that changes people's lives. And I always say the cool part of our profession, if you keep those 2 ideals I talked about at the very beginning, is we get a chance or I call an opportunity by the very nature of our job to be out in the middle of things happening. And we have a responsibility to take advantage of that opportunity to make a difference in people's lives. So whether it's in this arena or whether it's in social services or whether it's stepping in, that's what we all seek for. That's what we're here for. And certainly we want our officers thinking of it in that way, because today is a day you can make a difference in somebody's lives on perhaps their worst day. And as a community, how do we support all those things, I think, is what's the strength of this community.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Just kind of to close, I'd like us to just envision something for a moment. When we think about blessing our city, I think the first place we might go is to these extra things that we can do to be a blessing. And certainly, I think a night like tonight should cause us individually, but as a church, to really consider the ways God has richly blessed us, and to say, if we're taking this story with some grain of weight, we have to realize that He has blessed us so that we would be a blessing. And this ought to cause you to think about all the areas of your life, and ought to be a prayer point for you to say, God, how can I be a blessing? But I want to encourage you in this way. Many of you in this room are involved vocationally, or maybe some of you serve or give your time in various ways in kind of a station of your life. Martin Luther, the great reformer, has this sort of vocational theology that I think is so important for us as the church to consider and to think about. And that is this, that God has essentially placed you in those stations, in those places. When you think about the work that you do with your hands, the work that you do with your minds, the way in which you are vocationally active in your life, prayerfully say, God, help me to realize that you have placed me in this vocation so that you would bless others through my work. You would bless others through my career. You would bless others through my vocation. And if you want to picture it this way, Luther talked about, I believe it was the street sweepers, and said this is the way God sweeps the streets, is He has somebody that He blesses to sweep the streets for the city. And if you think about this and just extrapolate this into all our vocations in this room, or you think about categories of vocations, God has blessed schools by training up teachers to come in and lead classrooms. He's helping to educate children through the teachers. God has wired us, our imagination is opened up through authors that we read that have written books. And certainly this extends into the police department. God has, in his grace and His love to us, raised up men and women that would give their vocational skill to the task of protection and service for our communities. And so, are we all perfect? Absolutely not. Is there, imperfect teachers? Yes. Imperfect pastors? Yes. Imperfect police officers? Yes. But if you think about the ways in which God has positioned us and placed us as a city, I think for you it can spark some imagination in you to go, God, you are so big, you are so good, and also for you to consider where He's placed you, to say, God, help me to be faithful with the vocation and the skills that you've given to me, to serve them for your purposes. And so, Michael, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Would you guys just give a big hand for Michael Dvorak? And as we close, I want to encourage you. There's a resource here that I read a piece of. It's a book by Timothy Keller called Generous Justice. And we have this for sale at the bookshelf on Sunday mornings if you want to purchase one. I think it's about $15. But this is a really excellent book if you want to kind of wade into this topic a little further, the topic of justice. So I recommend that to you. Just a reminder to join us next month as Gary Kinnaman's going to be with us to talk about depression in the Christian. Gary's actually going to come and he's going to preach that morning, and then he's going to come and do our third Sunday as well. You'll hear a lot of his story. You will not want to miss this third Sunday. Let me just say that. So mark your calendars for that. And then finally, the last thing I want to mention is I mentioned Via Communities earlier, and we always talk about them at the close of our time on third Sundays. It's so important for you to have other people in your life that you're relationally connected to. Michael and I were actually talking about this earlier. There's nothing that can replace deep, significant relationships and friendships. And so this is the way in which we live on mission here at Via Church, is through our Via communities being activated. So the way in which you're introduced to those is through a 2-session class called Base Camp. And the next Base Camp starts next Sunday at 9 a.m. They're offered each month at kind of different times. So the next one starts on Sunday at 9 a.m. To close our time, what I'd like you to do is around your tables, pair up or triple up if you would, and pray along these lines. Take a few moments to pray regarding one of the aspects of your city that you heard about tonight. And pray maybe in smaller groups so you can maybe each have a turn to pray. But go ahead and do that, and then that will be our close for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. You guys have a great rest of your Sunday and a great week. And parents, your kids are back in school on Monday. So there you go. Bless you guys.